Justin, why don't you tell everyone what we're talking about tonight?
Okay, so in honor of this last December 2021 was the 20th anniversary of the film adaptation of The Fellowship of the Rings. So, today we really wanted to look at how Tolkien's original works, the actual novels of The Lord of the Rings, can be used as a prayer guide, and especially I think it's very, very useful as a prayer guide for men. For me personally, The Lord of the Rings, the first time that I read any Tolkien, I was in 3rd grade. I had finished all of the Narnia books, and I asked my mom, do you have anything else that's kind of like this, but not this, because I've read these over and over and over again? And she said, okay, well, you could try this thing called The Hobbit. I didn't really like it very much, but you give it a go. And so then from that point on, I was hooked. And ever since high school, I've read and reread the novels, I think, nonstop.
Yeah.
I should have brought in my mom's 1960s editions that I used to read, because they're paperback. They are falling apart. Like, I've hot glued portions of it back together again. I've used like cellophane tape to keep the covers together and stuff. So I love Lord of the Rings, and I was telling Brother Chris when we were trying to come up with an idea for what to do for our kind of our welcome back podcast for the new year. I said, I use the Lord of the Rings as a personal prayer guide more than any writings from any of the saints, more than the Catechism, more than even, if I have to admit it, more than even sacred scripture. I use the Lord of the Rings as a guide, sort of an inspirational guide for me when I seek good prayer time. A lot of times it's bookended by me reading portions of the books. So, anyway, what was Lord of the Rings for you, Brother Chris?
It's funny. I was probably around the same grade level because I'm older than you, but I remember
how much?
Fourth and fifth grade, maybe third, is when I discovered The Hobbit, and I liked it so much that I reread it every year and did my book report for that year on it. Mm-hmm. And then shortly afterwards, I found out about the trilogy. I mean, this would have been like 1979 or 80. So I used to have some really old versions of it. But I always loved it too. And to be honest, it was funny when the movies came out. I really remember when I first heard they were going to be made, I remember thinking, you can't make them. Like, they're too epic. It's not going to even be possible.
That's why the rights sold for so cheap.
So,
because the Tolkien estate thought there's no way that anyone can film these movies, so.
But I was more than pleasantly surprised. I thought they were great movies. So what I want to do, I'll start tonight just talk you a little bit about Tolkien, just one specific focus on him. Because we are a Christian, really Catholic show for this, I wanted to talk a little bit about his Catholicism and how it underlies things, but in the way in which he does it. And then we'll let Justin start to get into some of his specific events and stories and where they connect with Scripture. And I even have a few if there's time for that afterwards. But I wanted to talk about Tolkien because there was a lot of things I knew about his Catholicism and that he was a fervent Catholic, but I never really knew the whole story of why. But I think I'll start actually with one of his letters, which I think is a very interesting one to show without any qualification Tolkien's understanding of his Catholicism. And this was a letter he wrote to his son Michael in 1941. It makes up letters 53 to 54. And he's talking about the Eucharist. This is what he tells his son, who we're looking at, World War II now looming. He says, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the blessed sacrament. In it you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that, death. By that divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. And so I think it's important.
How beautiful is that?
Yeah, I had never heard that one, a direct quote about the Eucharist. And then when I learned about his life, it was very interesting. His mother was a young widow. He and his brother, whose name escapes me right now, Hillary, I think. He and his brother, they were very poor after the death of his father, and for unknown reasons, of which I'm sure there's more, I just couldn't uncover it in the time I had, struggling to like keep her small family together and supported, she suddenly made the surprising choice to secretly take instruction in the Catholic faith, and she was received into the Roman Catholic Church when Ronald J.R. Tolkien was 8 years old. The decision then resulted in both her own family, her parents, and her deceased husband's parents withdrawing all financial assistance. And so for 4 years, she worked herself so hard that she died when he was 12, at the age of 34. She collapsed into a diabetic coma, and he was 12. And at 19, 9 years after she passed away, he wrote this. He said, "My own dear mother was a martyr. Indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts as he did to Hilary, his brother, and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." And so between his mother's coming into the faith, her dramatic love of it, despite all the difficulties, sacrifices, suffering, and ultimately her death, just ingrained in him a powerful love, emotional, intellectual, everything for Catholicism. And then his mother had left he and his brother to the guardianship of Father Francis Morgan, an Oratorian priest who would raise them until they were 18. And so his mother's decision that he would have this continued Catholic upbringing was just really finally assured. Now, I just wanted to mention a couple other things at this point. So for me, that little thing, I knew he had been at one point orphaned, but I didn't know if that had been from a really young age or what. I knew he was deeply Catholic, of course, but I never knew that. And I thought it was really interesting just to hear about his mother, her desire, which we don't know why she chose to enter the faith. That would be nice if anyone does know. But just, I think it gives a little insight into his thing as well, because what he really did in The Lord of the Rings is he composed a Catholic myth. Mm-hmm. And I know some people don't like that because they don't like the religious connotations of that, but Tolkien himself in his letters was quite clear. The one thing he did great, though, is that he was able to do so without making anything so overtly so. You know,
unlike C.S. Lewis.
Right, and that was his actual critique. C.S. Lewis was his good friend, but he writes, in fact, it's in one of the editions, I can't remember which one, in his introduction, he talks about how he hates allegory. He hates the simple this for that, A for B approach. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, he responded in some of the letters I was reading to people who had seen images. So, for example, a priest friend of his writes and says, well, all the stories about Galadriel and even more Elbereth, the lady, you know, she's Marion. Kind of like this Marian figure. Mm-hmm. And Tolkien says, yeah. And then Lembas, the elven bread, can give you this strength beyond normal strength, kind of Eucharistic. Yeah, but not so you can see it, especially if you're Catholic, but not so overtly that other people look at it and go, oh, that's totally the Eucharist. Oh, that's that. I think what Tolkien did better was he really showed the whole theme of Catholic understanding of the world and human beings and such in the broad fabric. Mm-hmm. That's why the story is so great. Is you can look at it and say, you have this Catholic story, but it's not one that like throws itself into people. And I would, I also found this out, which I didn't know because I had seen the word in some of the articles written about him. Because of his love for languages, and those of you who don't know, that's really what he was. He was a philologist. He
Anyone who's read Beowulf
languages.
In high school,
you
know, you probably read his translation of Beowulf.
But he created his own Greek word, which by the linguistic rules of Greek is a legitimate word. It's eucatastrophe, or eucatastrophe. The sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with joy that brings you to tears. So much so it actually becomes part of the language. But and I don't know how many people know this. I know this because I was a D&D nerd growing up too. But until Tolkien, for example, the plural form of elf and dwarf were dwarfs and elves with just an S. Tolkien changed that because he said that that wasn't grammatically correct.
Oh, really?
And it's from his writings that why we put ES at the end of those words now. So, I mean, in even the most subtle ways, he would change even the English language, not to mention he created whole cloth multiple languages, different elven dialects, Noldorin, Sindarin, the dwarvish thing. I mean, just amazing stuff. But just a lot of what you read about him is amazing. So, for example, one of the things I was going to mention is he works these things in, but two of the things that I find interesting, like in a whole Catholic milieu, are one, his forgiveness and redemption ideas, and second, his ideas of free will. In free will, every character, an individual, makes the choices that determine their action, even ones that are, quote, prophetic, like the death of the Witch King. It still has to be Eowyn has to decide she's going to carry it out, that she can carry it out, and she actually does carry it out. And then even the characters who seem to fit the classical mold of the pagan stories of like fated individuals, and in this I'm kind of moving beyond the Lord of the Rings to his larger stories of Turin Turambar, which Turin lives his whole life thinking he's cursed by Morgoth. But in reality, as the story is portrayed, when you really look at it, Tolkien is at pains to make sure that, no, it's not Morgoth. It's ultimately his own pride, foolishness, and such that lead to each of these individual accounts that his life ends in this tragic thing. So even there, it's the idea of being fated is an illusion because he lives it out by his own choices. So I always thought that was kind of interesting. And the other one, and I'll have you talk about this later in more detail too, is the story that Frodo tries relentlessly to get Gollum to repent and be forgiven. And it kind of starts with that moment where he wishes he was dead and Gandalf tells him no.
It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance.
Pity? It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo?
Mm-hmm. And then later he has the opportunity when he's with Faramir and the Rangers to kill Gollum again, and he says no. And then throughout this whole time, and of course Gollum never accepts it, but what's ironic in the story, if people don't realize it, is at the end he actually failed.
The ring is mine.
So I think that's the crazy part of the story.
Yeah.
At the very end, when he's set to destroy it, he chooses not only not to destroy it, but to put it on. And so he fails in the end, but in a sense, all his goodness, his trying to get his pardon of Gollum and everything works in his favor, that even though Gollum selfishly bites the ring and takes it, in a sense he saves Frodo from his own fate at the end, and so there's this kind of redemption.
It's very Augustinian.
Yeah, he gets this big grace thing.
Yeah.
So
that God is so great. And it's important to note that in the mythology that Tolkien sets up for Middle-earth, there is one supreme being. Mm-hmm. There is a stand-in for the one divine Godhead, Eru Iluvatar, right? But there is this notion of the good that you have built up, the good that you have merited, or you've built up good merits in the past. When you screw up, those kind of come back to help you.
Yeah.
So like God is so great that even the worst thing he can reverse, without denying your freedom and bring out even greater good from it. So because Frodo was compassionate towards Gollum / Smeagol through the entire story, when Frodo screws up, it's this weird twist where Gollum is the one who ends up taking that ring down into the pits of the fiery mountain. So yeah, amazing.
So how do you actually mechanically, so to speak, use the book to pray?
So there's first what we need to understand like I said previously, I use the Lord of the Rings specific passages from it, and at the same time reading through it over and over and over again is kind of a prayerful meditation tool, which is probably the nerdiest prayer meditation tool of all time. Reading Lord of the Rings over and over and over again. But first, let me explain why I think it's so effective, and I think it's particularly effective for men. Men of all ages, I would say, can be really we can really get something out of the Lord of the Rings by applying it to our prayer life, and I think the big reason why revolves around this idea of inspiration. The Bible is very inspiring to read. It is. The writings of the saints are very inspiring to read too. But there is something uniquely inspiring about a story that is so foundationally Catholic that's also a fantasy. Because the fantasy is a story that you can get sucked into in a way, I think, that you just can't when it's sort of like a manual that's written by a saint, or a commentary written by a saint, or any one of the biblical passages that you might find useful. Quinn dropping stuff. No, anyway, Tolkien is an inspiring writer. The way that he writes to his son about the importance of the Eucharist, the way that he writes, first of all, doesn't that make you jealous of how beautifully eloquent this man is? He writes so that he can inspire. And, you read one of his letters to his kid, and it just makes you feel bad for the text messages that you sent to your wife. You know what I mean? The text messages that you sent to your daughters and stuff. It's like nothing nearly that beautiful, that's for sure.
And if I could just interject for a moment, just because you kind of touched on something I didn't even bring up the last segment we had, but here's what Tolkien himself said, after thinking back on it later, when he was asked by someone, did you do so from these myths by reading them? Were you inspired because there was a series of artwork that had been done? Like, what was it that got you inspired? And he said, no, none of those. And the man said to him in a letter, or no, they were meeting person to person. The visitor said to him, and it's interesting, Tolkien later couldn't recall who the man was, just that he was really important at the time, because he was reminiscing like 30 years later. He said the man looked at him with dead in the face and said, you know you didn't write this by yourself, right? And here's what Tolkien said, talking about inspiring. The story arose in my mind as given things. They always came. Separately too, the links between the various stories grew. Always I had the sense of recording what was already there somewhere, not of inventing it. So interesting that you brought that up, and then that just recalled something I had seen and I had read, that Tolkien himself felt that, in a sense, his work was being guided. Not that it was a Bible inspiration, but he did feel like he was really being called by the Spirit to record, a Catholic myth.
And that's
for
why
the
the mythos that he sets up is so tight. The screws are really tightened on that thing.
Right.
It's really hard to find loopholes in sort of the metaphysics, the cosmology that he's set up. If you want to read the Silmarillion, it's like you're reading kind of like another version of Genesis, the first 5 or 6 books. But anyway,
so
I think the inspiration thing, that's the big thing.
Yeah.
Especially for men, in a world where we're losing great role models that our parents had, the World War II generation, people that really struggled, that really saw hardship, like true hardship, that could then pass on wisdom to us and inspire us through their stories. We're losing that,
And just sacrifice.
True sacrifice, like people who wanted to sacrifice so badly. I was watching the first episode of Band of Brothers just recently, where one of the old vets that they interviewed at the beginning, he said, in my small town, guys killed themselves because they were 4F and couldn't go.
We came from a small town, and 3 fellows in that town that were 4F committed suicide because they couldn't go at different time.
You know, it's a different time. Like, people wanted to go and sacrifice. And so what Tolkien has given, especially to young men in these stories, because just about every main character is a man, is a male character in these stories. He has given us sort of these timeless iconic characters in these really really moving situations that we could all kind of see in our own lives. And he's given us sort of, this is how you can meet these trials that you struggle through, and feel inspired by these characters to stand up and do something, in the name of the faith, and really just be a true man,
Yeah.
It's awesome. So the way that I personally approach the Lord of the Rings, like I said, I usually start and end my prayers by reading just wherever I've left off. I'll read a little bit, and I'll stop and pray, and then I'll keep reading, and then typically it's at night.
Yeah.
So, and then I'll go to sleep. But there are I think it's impossible to read the Lord of the Rings without having certain passages that just stick with you.
Mm.
And they stick with you for a reason. I think it's because they are inspiring, but I think that there's some sort of real truth that they hit upon, moral truth, theological truths, even though it's not a theological manual by any means, but there's just something that reaches through the pages that really just will get anybody. And there's tons of passages like that throughout the books. And so for me, a lot of times I almost like get into a prayer mood by reading, starting from wherever I left off the previous night. I'll read a little bit, then I'll stop, I'll pull out my prayer journal, and usually in my journal, the first thing that I write down is a passage or something that I've memorized from the books that I find to be particularly inspiring, It just gets me into the mood of like, okay, prayer is a battle. Let's go to battle, and start. I'll start writing in my prayer journal and waiting for the Lord to say things to me, and then I'll scribe stuff back. I think there are times for sure where the Lord his response to me has been other passages from the books, There's your example. Follow that, When you have issues, look to that, and you can be inspired and kind of do the right thing. It's pretty cool.
You really are. I think you really do understand Tolkien. It's interesting because, again, I'm looking at a quote from him talking about really what you just mentioned about how when you read it, you see the moral implications, the religious ones, even though it's not overt. Mm-hmm. And here's what he says. Myth and fairy story must reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but never explicitly, not in the known form of the primary real world. Mm-hmm. So he communicates the things through the story, through the fantasy, but you see it. You see how it's lived out. So Quinn, we have to put you on the spot now. You've got how old's Isaac?
He is 9.
9. So when you're gonna let him read the Lord of the Rings?
I should. Well, first the Hobbit.
You could show him the movies too.
First?
He should probably, if you're around 7 to 10 years old, I would probably say start with the Hobbit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Start with the Hobbit. It's really, really accessible, I think, at that age.
Right, because it's the adventure.
Yeah. And then
and it's short.
Then as you go through each of the trilogy, then you can watch the movie after you finish that one, and then read the second one.
Yeah.
So he can have heroism and courage.
There are moments throughout the stories that you can use to address almost any situation or emotion that you might bring to the Lord in your prayers. And so I wanted to start off by just kind of looking at 3 passages that really speak to me. Because one has to do, especially as a man with husband and kids, or husband, jeez, who is a husband with a wife and kids. three passages that speak to me. One has to do with the role of a husband as priest of the household. Another has to do with our kingship. And then the third one has to do with sort of our prophetic role. Okay. We're going to struggle with the world trying to pull us away from being priest, prophet, and king in our households. We go through a world that doesn't want us to recognize that our full potential, what our full potential is as priest, prophet, and king over our households. And so here's these passages calling men to really be inspired by the fact that these are roles that we are supposed to be fulfilling in our households. These are roles that we're supposed to be embracing, and they're not easy. And that's why I think in particular these passages really stand out to me. So the first one is this passage from the Bridge of Khazad-dûm in the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring. Well, actually, the first volume, but the second book,
right,
The Fellowship of the Ring. So in the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, you have the Fellowship of the Ring. It's 9 companions led by Gandalf, the wizard, who are essentially trapped underground in an abandoned mine that evil goblins and orcs have taken over, and they don't know it, right? Mm-hmm. So they're trapped in this thing. They're surrounded by the forces of evil, essentially. And then, just when you think things can't get any worse for them because they're surrounded by goblins, orcs, and what have you, all of a sudden, a new creature arrives that's ancient, evil. It's essentially a demon. In the movies, Gandalf says it's a demon of the ancient world, yeah. A Balrog of Morgoth. And this thing, it's massive, flaming, smoke-winged demon creature with a giant flaming whip in one hand and a giant flaming sword in the other, right? And it towers over everybody. His wingspan covers up the entire chasm. And so they're trapped by this thing. And Gandalf alone stands on the bridge to face him down. And so this is what Gandalf says. He says to the demon, "You cannot pass," Gandalf said. The orcs stood still and a dead silence fell. Gandalf continues, "I am a servant of the secret fire.
Wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you. Flame of Udun! Go back to the shadow. You shall not pass!
So, in the past, you know how like we've done Exodus 90 together, and I'm actually on Exodus 90 now, which is why I am drinking Athletic Brewing, non-alcoholic beer, local San Diegan non-alcoholic beer. It's delicious. But anyway, it comes up in conversation a lot of times when we have like our brotherhood meeting, our fraternity meeting, that Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, facing down the demon, saying, "You cannot pass." That's what we husbands are supposed to be doing spiritually for our households. There are demons knocking at the door all the time. And we, to quote James chapter 4, verse 7, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." We're like the first line of defense for our families. Our priesthood over the house is exercised in us praying for deliverance from these evil things. And, you know, geez, Chris, all the time, like we feel like things are trying to just pull us down and cause despair in us and try to distract us from this, right?
Yeah.
Your Achilles tendon, work, kids are acting like brats. Like there's lots of distractions that try to pull us away from our priesthood.
Well, I mean, in the image of, the old man facing the huge creature, and in a sense, although not to spoil it for people, he defeats it, but he does die. I mean,
oh yeah,
and then
he sacrifices
himself. So
he kills the thing, but then he dies in the process.
Right,
yeah. But how inspiring! When you feel like the world is just crushing down on you, and there's just too much evil. I mean, the darkness is just everywhere. Especially during this time period, like we're going through kind of the tail end of the pandemic, but I mean, the last 2.5 years were very, very difficult.
Yeah.
It was very difficult to feel inspired to pick up like our staff of priesthood and be real priests for the house, And so for me, I turned to this passage almost daily, and read it and reread it in order to get myself into a mood to pray, because I needed to see Gandalf telling the demon, "You cannot pass," and being willing to offer up his life for his friends in the process, so that I could feel inspired to then, be that for my household. Mm-hmm. So there you go, understanding a husband's role as priest of the house.
So I have a trivia question.
Yeah.
And maybe Quinn can look it up, but so let's see if Justin knows this one.
Ooh.
Now, National Tolkien Reading Day it's March 25th. Do you know why they chose March 25th as National Tolkien Reading Day?
No, is that when they're in Moria?
It's the date of the destruction of the ring.
Oh, interesting.
Takes place in Now, I think, and this is what I want Quinn maybe can look up, was March 25th Easter of the year that Tolkien did something, like finished it, or World War II, something? I thought it was connected to the date of Easter.
I know that he lines up a lot of the dates with Catholic feast days.
Right.
So like the Immaculate Conception and the conception of Jesus and stuff.
So Quinn, maybe you can Google Tolkien March 25th and see if anything comes up. But it'd be interesting to know, because he does line up, because he uses kind of our calendar in a sense.
Yeah. He like has liturgical events occur at certain moments in the story. It's really interesting.
It's actually known as the Day of Doom, of great fate or destiny. And it's basically saying that it was thought that both the day of creation of Adam and Eve, as well as the day of their disobedience in the garden, and not only that, was believed to be the exact day that our Lord was crucified on the cross, it was also counted as the day when Lucifer fell from heaven, and when the Israelite people passing through the Red Sea began their journey to the Promised Land, and also the day when Isaac was to be offered as a sacrifice by his father Abraham. So it's a full day.
A full day.
Yeah.
Especially probably the Christian one, and maybe the fall of Lucifer combined in a sense, because it unravels Sauron's power here on Earth. And awesome.
Wow.
I wanted to quote something, though, from J.R.R. Tolkien's letters that again shows the real depths of his spirituality, his Catholic faith. And this, in November 1944, he wrote to his son Christopher, who was asking his father questions about his guardian angel. I think that's interesting in and of itself, because he would have had to have been at least 18, if not in his 20s, but he's still asking his dad about his guardian angel. But
man, I hope my girls ask me those sorts of questions when they're teenagers.
At this point in the letter, J.R.R. Tolkien actually explains a vision he had. So this is very interesting. He said, "I had a sudden vision not long ago when spending half an hour in St. Gregory's before the Blessed Sacrament. I perceived or thought of the light of God, and in it suspended one small mote, or millions of motes, to only one of which my small mind directed, glittering white because of the individual ray from the light which both held it and lit it. Not that there were individual rays issuing from the light, but the mere existence of the mote and its position in relation to the light was in itself a line, and the line was light. The ray that shined from the light was the guardian angel of the mote. The mote, of course, are human beings. The guardian angel is not a thing interposed between God and his creatures, but God's very attention itself personalized. And I do not mean personalized by some mere figure of speech according to the tendencies of human language, but a real, finite person. Thinking of it, since for the whole thing was very immediate and not recapturable in clumsy language, certainly not in the great sense of joy that accompanied it, and the realization that the shining poised mote was myself, or any other human person I might think of with love, it occurred to me that this is a finite parallel to the infinite. As the love of the Father and the Son, who are infinite and equal, is a person, the Holy Spirit, so the love and attention of the light to the mote is a person that is both with us and in heaven, finite but divine, angelic. So from his vision, he gives a description of what he thinks a guardian angel is in comparison to God and us. Yeah, I mean...
If you had given me that passage without telling me who wrote it,
yeah,
I would have guessed it was like Augustine.
Yeah.
You know? Wow. Anyway, continuing on, you know how laziness is a huge problem?
Oh, yeah.
I feel it all the time where it's like, I think my natural inclination is to just sit back and like, I just want to drink a beer and watch movies and stuff.
I always struggle with it anyways, but because I exercise so regularly, it was great. But when I pulled this Achilles tendon, I could do nothing for 6 weeks. Yeah. I mean, not that there was a lot I could do, but I just kind of wallowed in it.
Oh, you
watched
tried,
TV.
though. You tried.
I ate food. I ate horrible food. It was just worthless. So
the day that you tore that tendon,
I know,
you still showed up here and gave a lecture. So, yeah, man of action. Well, anyway, trying to walk off a torn Achilles tendon. Is a bad
I know.
idea.
Just walk it off.
So.
I didn't know.
Well, so I think that laziness, especially for our culture right now with men, it's such a problem. You know, I deal with it. I think every guy deals with it. We've got smartphones, computers, stuff to play video games is so affordable. Like, there's movies at our beck and call now. We don't need to wait for something to show up on TV. We can just find it, you know, and just play it, buy it, play it whenever you want. And so I think that really one of the tools of Satan, man, it's overstimulation, entertainment.
That'd be sloth, right? Sloth, I mean, in one sense, you're very active, but you're actively lazy.
Actively being lazy, yeah. Like, I will force myself to sit in this chair and watch this movie until like 4 a.m. I'll just binge watch shows and stuff. Well, here's Tolkien through his great work, you know, calling us to understand, like, that's not what we're meant to be. We're supposed to be stewards, kings, men of action, okay? Not men who try to avoid our spiritual and physical responsibilities, you know? And one passage that really speaks to me, so when I'm really struggling with spiritual laziness, this is also a good one to watch, like a clip from the movies, because it's just so powerful. But in the book, I think it's even better. It's when Theoden, he's the king of sort of like Tolkien's version of the Vikings,
right?
You know,
yeah.
He's sort of, his court has been infiltrated by the evil wizard Saruman through this character of Wormtongue, and Wormtongue, that's your key that he's a bad guy. His name is Wormtongue. Like, you probably shouldn't trust a guy who goes by the moniker of Wormtongue. But anyway, Wormtongue sneaks in and he starts sort of whispering this sort of venom into the ear of Theoden. Over time, it makes Theoden into basically a couch potato. Like, he just sits in the throne. I don't want to do anything. You know, whatever Wormtongue says, fine. I'll just stamp it, and then there you go. In the movies, they portray it as an actual physical corruption too, which I really kind of liked. You know, like the corruption of evil. It isn't just when it's spiritual, it doesn't only affect your mind. You know, when you're just sitting there being lazy, it just turns you into some decrepit, horrible version of yourself, you know? So Gandalf, he takes Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, and they go to basically like cure Theoden of this spiritual sloth that he's going through. And Gandalf, he does it in a really cool way. Like he basically, through the power of his voice, like commands the evil influence out of Theoden. And so this is where the passage that really speaks to me begins. Slowly Theoden sat down again, as if weariness still struggled to master him against the will of Gandalf. He turned and he looked at his great house. Alas, he said, that these evil days should be mine, and should come in my old age instead of that peace which I have earned. Alas for Boromir the brave, the young perish and the old linger, withering. He clutched his knees with his wrinkled hands. Your fingers would remember their old strength better if they grasped a sword hilt, said Gandalf. Theoden rose and put his hand to his side, but no sword hung at his belt. Where has Grima Wormtongue stowed it? He muttered under his breath. Take this, dear lord, said a clear voice. It was ever at your service. 2 men had come softly up the stair and stood now a few steps from the top. Éomer was there. No helm was on his head, no mail on his breast, but in his hand he held a drawn sword, and as he knelt, he offered the hilt to his master. Will you not take the sword? Said Gandalf. Slowly Theoden stretched forth his hand. As his fingers took the hilt, it seemed to the watchers that firmness and strength returned to his arm. Suddenly he lifted the blade and swung it, shimmering and whistling in the air. Then he gave a great cry. His voice rang clear as he chanted in the tongue of Rohan a call to arms. Arise now, arise, riders of Theoden. Dire deeds awake, dark is it eastward. Let horse be bridled, horn be sounded. Forth, Eorlingas! The guards, thinking that they were summoned, sprang up the stair. They looked at their lord in amazement, and then, as one man, they drew their swords and laid them at his feet. Command us, they said. That's freaking beautiful.
That's cool.
So there's a reason why a couple Decembers ago when we were going through our Advent Exodus 90, I gave a gift to all the guys.
I thought about. I wished I had brought it after I was already.
I know.
there.
I should have brought mine. But these engraved swords, and these weren't just like little toy wooden swords. These are like legit swords, and it's because I had read this
with our names on them.
Yeah, they're engraved with our names and everything. Really awesome. Super nerdy gift, but come on.
I think it's amazing. I think I told you one time we were at home and the doorbell rang and we weren't expecting one, and Ellie goes, "Do you want me to get the sword?" I'm like, no, I'll just look through the peephole first. It's all right.
Who are these Viking children?
Get out the sword yet?
Yeah. There's a number of reasons why this speaks to me. First of all, a lot of times it is not us. Well, every time it's never us who calls ourselves out of the sloth, right? Yes, we have to cooperate with the grace of God, but it is the grace of God that gets us out of our slothfulness. It's the grace of God that gets us, that provides any of the virtues and fruits of the Spirit, really. And so I love that it's not Gandalf showing up and saying, "Hey, pick yourself up." It's Gandalf by like commanding. And it's almost a stand-in for the grace of God, right? Gandalf is like the arbiter of this grace. Like, come on, I'm calling you as a priest. Here's the grace. Let's go.
Without spoiling anything, we started. It's funny how things are connecting. I don't think you need to worry about
spoiling it. The books are what? How many decades old?
We read about Tolkien and his description of what real guardian angels he feels are, but Gandalf is
he's an angel.
He's an angel,
a lower angel,
right?
But an angel nonetheless. Yeah. So. And what I love too is like when we really embrace our kingship, it's like what happens? Other people will come and be a part of it, like Éomer is Theoden's nephew.
Right.
When he sees the Theoden starting to re-embrace his kingship, and Eomer's there to lay his sword at his feet. And then when Theoden picks up the sword and gives that battle cry, other men spring to action. They're like, I want to follow this guy. And so it's almost like your kingship isn't just a call to be something, it's to lead other people in being something great. And for us as men, it's not just our households, our wives and our kids that we're called to lead. It's also other men, and other men are called to lead us. And I think it's just beautiful. I put down here in our notes that, to me, it reminds me of Ephesians 6. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power. Put on the whole armor of God so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to withstand on that evil day, and having done everything to stand firm. Stand therefore and fasten the belt of truth around your waist, and put on the breastplate of righteousness as shoes for your feet. Put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all of these, take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. It's like Theoden is our sort of manifestation of that happening in this novel. And so for me, when I feel like, man, the armor of God is just too much for me, I read this passage, I'll write portions of it down. The battle cries, a lot of my prayer journals, there's a lot of battle cries in Tolkien. A lot of my prayer journals start off or end with me quoting one of those directly,
grandma, my sweet 4'10" grandma growing up, Irish and stuff. I remember even as a little kid, she'd be like, always be honorable and don't do anything to embarrass the family. But it makes me think of that. It's that whole Irish thing of going back, you're like, my parents did this, my grandparents, I don't want to be the weak link. Don't make me be the weak link. I'm going to stand up and I'll do what I need to do. And in the religious sense too, that it's all carried forth in this.
If you look at Theoden's situation too, you find out earlier, right before this happens, that his son has died.
Right.
His only heir. So it's like, one would be tempted to say, well, what's the point? Why shouldn't I just be lazy? Why do I need to go do anything? And it's just great. It's like, no, the grace is there knocking at the door. Come on, pick up your sword and go and fight. And so for us, that could be any number of things, bust out that journal and pray, bust open the scriptures and pray with your kids, pray with your wife, pray with your friends, and other people are going to flock to your house because it's going to be a refuge of grace for them, right. So I love that passage. And then finally, this kind of follows along with that because it's another Gandalf one. But so we've gone through us embracing our roles as priest and king. So there's another vocation of Christ that we're called to follow in his footsteps, which is our role as prophets. The evil wizard Saruman, there comes a point where Gandalf has to address him. And so Saruman's sort of thrown down. He's defeated in battle, and Gandalf needs to go and basically tell him what's what. And this is how the passage goes. So Saruman's face grew livid, twisted with rage, and a red light was kindled in his eyes. He turned and left the balcony. "Come back, Saruman," said Gandalf in a commanding voice. And to the amazement of the others, Saruman turned again. And as if being dragged by his will, he came slowly back to the iron rail, leaning on it, breathing hard. His face was lined and shrunken. His hand clutched his heavy black staff like a claw. "I did not give you leave to go," said Gandalf sternly. "I have not finished. You have become a fool, Saruman, and yet pitiable. You might still have turned away from folly and evil and have been of service. But you choose to stay and gnaw the ends of your old plots. Stay then, but I warn you, you will not easily come out again. Not unless the dark hands of the east stretch out to take you, Saruman," he cried, and his voice grew in power and authority. "Behold, I am not Gandalf the Grey, whom you betrayed. I am Gandalf the White, who has returned from death. You have no color now, and I cast you from the order and from the council." He raised his hand and spoke slowly in a clear, cold voice. "Saruman,
your staff is broken."
was a crack, and the staff split asunder in Saruman's hand, and the head of it fell down at Gandalf's feet. "Go," said Gandalf, and with a cry, Saruman fell back and crawled away. So in my notes, I said that this reminds me a lot of Genesis 3, when the Lord says to the serpent, "Because you've done this, cursed are you among all the animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." The reason why this speaks to me, and why I think this is inspiring for men, it just kind of calls us to embrace our roles as prophet of our household. It shows us how effective the truth is, the word of God, that we should boldly preach it, and that here you've got the evil, like the fallen angel Saruman, right? When the good angel speaks the word of command, the word of truth to him, he cannot help but obey.
Yeah.
You know, and to a lesser, I guess a less grave extent, you could say, with our children, with our wives, with our, you know, and when our wives offer us correction too, that the word of truth, it pierces, and so we should accept it boldly. We should offer it boldly, it just really also the imagery of your staff is broken.
Yeah, his sign of power, all of his authority.
Yeah, the authority of the evil one cannot withstand the authority of the one God of the truth. It's amazing. And so what are we to fear? You know, preach the truth always. And that seems really difficult nowadays in light of just the world, right? Postmodernism is kind of the new religion of our day, and we stand as sort of a minority against it now in the West. And we should just, when it tries to invade our households, because it will, speak the truth anyway. Break the staff of that evil, and then, you know, lead in the truth. So
awesome.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and wrap it up for tonight, and we'll continue this. We'll I don't know, maybe we'll have a few more of you sharing, and then we'll definitely, like we said, we'll also do a compare contrast.
Oh yeah,
sort of with the movie, and also a lot of these same scenes, as Justin's already pointed out, are good ones that the movie gives you, those who like the visual thing to kind of look at and reflect on in your mind. But thank you for watching. God bless you guys, and until next time, we'll see you then.